Welcome to the prime time as chosen by the patrons as we give you Primarina. The final stage of the popular starter Puplio, Primarina is inarguably the most sophisticated and stylish of the Generation 7 starting duo. It is an aquatic, operatic ballerina, bringing refinement and class to any team blessed with its presence. And just look at its grand performance with Lana in the anime. Today we're going to examine Primarina's impact on the competitive scene. And now let's ask today's question, how good was Primarina actually? But before we start, we quickly want to mention our Patreon. Look, we haven't actually aggressively advertised the Patreon since all the way back in 2018 with the Aerodactyl video. We've only mentioned it in passing ever since then, and the patrons have been voting on a how good was actually Pokemon each month for years now. Why are we telling you this? Well, because we're going to step it up. Not only will we be inviting patrons to vote on more types of videos and video ideas, we will also be adding exclusive content to our Patreon, exploring deep dives of the fascinating histories and details of every imaginable aspect of competitive Pokemon history, featuring both myself and our writer BKC, as well as more potential guests. So if you want to support the channel directly, this is the best place to do it. And check out our Patreon at patreon.com/fallswipegaming. And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Despite a multitude of positive attributes, Primarina was never going to make it in an OU whose special attacking water fairy type of choice was the highly important Tapu Fini. No matter though, as Primarina simply took its talents to UU. Its typing was superb on both sides of the offensive-defensive spectrum, providing it with both valuable resistances and strong stabs packing great coverage, and it had its stats to back it up for both attacking and defending purposes. Underwhelming speed was more than compensated for by solid HP, great special defense, and outstanding special attack. Primarina was primed for UU stardom, and it didn't disappoint. Its flagship variant was always Choice Specs, with the stunning power of its stabs muscling through anything that wasn't a specific special wall. While it hit plenty Pokemon either super effective or neutral, high base special attack combined with its stabs high base power meant it was blasting through even many a resist, be it with Hydro Pump, Moonblast, or Sparkling Aria, which was just as strong as Surf. Primarina also had tremendous defensive utility without even trying. It was most notably a naturally amazing check to none other than Hydreigon, one of UU's most elite, while also checking other threats like Infernape. This was incredible utility for a Pokemon whose primary task was skull-crushing wall-breaking power. Indeed, Specs Primarina was so terrifying, it mandated the use of one of Blissey, Empoleon, Amoonguss, or Tentacruel, any defensive team looking to take hits. Otherwise, you would get absolutely destroyed, given that even though it was a slower offensive Pokemon, it still outpaced the bulky Pokemon such teams used, and it had the hit-taking ability to switch in easily, to say nothing of how even if it were frail, it'd get opportunities galore given the plethora of switch moves in the tier. Those 4 Pokemon were great in their own right, so it's not like this was an especially restrictive effect of Primarina's presence, but of those 4, only Blissey and Empoleon were truly safe. Both Amoonguss and Tentacruel had much to fear from Primarina Specs Psychic. Speaking of Scald, Primarina wielded it well on its defensive counterpart variant, the Rest Talk set, which invested fully in defense to compensate for the lower base stat, and making it quite apt at taking physical hits as a result, while it was still a natural stud at tanking special hits with just max HP, especially since it healed now, and its reliance on Rest Talk for recovery didn't render it passive given its 2 great stabs it wielded through Sleep Talk, especially with Scald's famous burns. This made Prima an excellent Pokemon for bulkier balanced teams looking to reinforce their defensive integrity against the slew of offensive threats running around. However, when it came down to it, Specs Primarina was it, one of the most defining threats around. In fact, between its ability to get on the field as much as it did and the nigh impossibility of switching into it safely, even the recovery lacking Empoleon could get worn down by repeated Hydro Pumps, especially if Primarina tossed Scald into its moveset and afflicted it with Burn. It was then there wound up being some talk of suspecting Primarina, though nothing ever came of it. If you didn't have Blissey, Primarina was going to mess you up. This might sound like an exaggeration, but as the metagame progressed, it only became more true. It was incredibly easy to build a team that was mostly solid against the meta at large, but wound up up being massively Primo weak because of the specificity it demanded in dealing with it, especially as the substitute 3 attack set popped up. By removing the need for prediction with sub, it was easier than ever to draw in Amoonguss and slice through it with Psychic. If Specs had one flaw, it was its prediction heavy nature, but Primarina was hardly left wanting for power when it took its Specs off either. It was still crushing most everything, and it even wound up ruining Empoleon, as its subs blanked any attempts at knockoff or scald burns, while it got to repeatedly scald it itself. The closest non-Blissey answer was Recovery Celebi, which still took seriously hefty damage from Moonblast, forcing predictable, exploitable recovers. As always, Primarina's typing and bulk, now bolstered by the leftovers it was carrying, ensured it got many free turns against tier staples like Latias, Hippowdon, Mega Sharpedo, and so many others. Both countering it and limiting it were immensely difficult. The best you would generally get out of the exchange was some sort of trade. For instance, instead of switching with Crocodile, you might just give it up to land that Earthquake on Primarina's lower defensive stat, so it's effectively out of commission afterwards. The problem is, of course, that you have lost your Crocodile to do so. Players tried all sorts of lures for Prima. Z-Ground Crocodile was one to turn the aforementioned scenario in Crook's favor, while the more surprising was Z-Belch Hydreigon. Others included Roar Empoleon to bypass sub, Pastro Berry Nihilego, and even an increase in Volcarona usage, though it had to contend with Stealth Rock. These were useful Pokemon, but Primarina just kept trucking on. Overall, Primarina garnered a great deal of controversy and frustration, but above all else, it was one of Gen 7 UU's most superb defining Pokemon. Generation 8 blessed Primarina with 2 amazing gifts: Calm Mind, self-evident in its elevation of Primarina's special attacking game, and Draining Kiss as an alternate fairy stab. Yes, its power was far lower than that of Moonblast, but it could be assuaged with Calm Mind's boost, and the fact that Draining Kiss healed a whopping 75% of damage dealt made it particularly appealing to reinforce Primarina's bulk, again made possible through Calm Mind. Primarina also received Flip Turn, which had great potential, but it didn't wind up amounting to much. It actually saw some decent OU use throughout the generation, as it was quite decent into bulkier teams. Its use was Scatter Shot, but it was quite decent in the days before Crown Tundra and the similarly buffed Tapu Fini. Primarina's real business, though, was of course in its old home of UU. Early in the generation's home metagame, it was actually banned from the tier off the strength of a highly unusual set: Calm Mind, Rest, Moonblast, and Snore. Usually Primarina had no need for its liquid voice ability, but here it used it for a stab Water Snarl that made it incredibly threatening even while asleep. Primarina thus spent much of the generation in BL. It wasn't even free during the expanded Isle of Armor metagame because it was still quite evident it would destroy all in its path. However, come Crown Tundra, there had been sufficient power creep to where the player base dared take the chance, and though Primarina wasn't quite broken, it had the same effect as in its debut generation, where it was brutally good and was indeed considered for a suspect test at multiple points. Checking Primarina was nightmarish because its Moonblast was so spammable by virtue of traditional fairy answers being thwarted by it one way or another. Fire types were obviously not an option, but forget using a Steel into it either. Poisons didn't do well either. Amoonguss wasn't just a worse check, it was actual setup fodder for sub-Calm Mind antics, while Nihilego feared Scald. Primarina was already excellent with the return of its Specs and Rest Talk sets, but it packed several new variants now, not just Calm Mind ones, that enhanced its threat level greatly, since not only were those sets all excellent, but their sheer variety meant it was incredibly easy to slot Primarina on a huge variety of teams and extract immense value from it, both offensively and defensively, able to take on so many opposing Pokemon and team styles. Just like Primarina overall, the 3 attacks variant on its own had so many options to mix and match. Substitute excelled as before, but Primarina could also wield Encore to great effect, creating unique opportunities by locking opponents into an exploitable move, while it also utterly delighted using Protect to wring as much longevity out of its leftovers as possible. It could and did also run Calm Mind along these 3 attacks, allowing it to increase its wall-breaking potential or go for a late-game clean against bulkier teams. Even its item choice, though usually leftovers, could be swapped out for the ability to turn the tables on would-be checks Zarude and Tangrowth, now able to withstand their power whips. Speaking of Calm Mind, the sub-Calm Mind Draining Kiss set seen in OU was also effective, as was the Calm Mind Rest variant. Primarina's power was already questionable for UU, and this ability to so easily mess with its few checks by effortlessly switching to another excellent moveset just exacerbated things. The idea didn't lead to any concrete action, but further established Primarina as a superb, defining UU Pokemon once again. Primarina spent all of its release generation utterly neglected in VGC, where it paled in comparison to Tapu Fini and struggled with the overwhelming ubiquity of Tapu Koko. But the limited format of Sword and Shield Series 5 gave this diva a chance to step into the spotlight. Dynamax gave Primarina just the bulk needed to overcome its low speed and make use of that base 126 special attack. Primarina was a frequent choice for Dynamax Life Orb slot, able to fire off powerful max Starfalls, Geysers, and through its access to Blizzard, Hailstorms. This last move was essential in targeting down the otherwise problematic Amoonguss. That said, Primarina could sometimes just muscle through the Mushroom. Despite the type advantage, Max Starfall's Misty Terrain was a valuable aid against potential spores. Primarina benefited from good matchups against common threats such as Dragapult and Incineroar. Get it in Trick Room and it could carry entire games on its own. That's what Korea Trainers Cup champion Song-Yoon Jeong did, matching Primarina with a duel of Porygon 2 and Porygon Z. Jeong notably made use of Primarina's hidden ability Liquid Voice to create powerful spread hyper voices even when not Dynamaxed, allowing it to function alongside Porygon Z, which demanded going max mode to see success. While the dual ducks were the highlight of Jeong's team, it was a different core that would catch on: the Fire Water Grass trio of Incineroar, Rillaboom, and Primarina. Primarina's functioned in perfect harmony with its fellow starters, covering their weakness to fire and dragon types while they handled grass types or faster Pokemon with their priority. Together they functioned in perfect harmony. All three sported natural bulk as well as an ability to perform under different forms of speed control, making them one of the most solid cores of the format, no matter what other backup singers surrounded them. If you didn't want to look like a 10-year-old obsessed with his very first Pokemon, some trainers swapped out Rillaboom for Ferrothorn. Primarina's fellow Alolan starter, however, was non-negotiable. That was showcased at the very first Players' Cup, where 5 of the 16 qualified players used Primarina. 3 opted for the starter trio, the other 2 slotted in Ferrothorn, but all of the Primarinas were slightly different. Torrent was the overwhelming ability of choice for everyone but 5th placer Christopher Kahn, while Liquid Voice was nice out of Dynamax. It was totally useless when the fat lady was singing, while Torrent could potentially provide a huge boost, especially considering Primarina's bulk. Christopher also opted for Assault Vest as his item, while most other players chose Life Orb. 3rd placer Nico Davide Cognetta chose Expert Belt, which helped his Blizzard's coverage out while freeing up the much coveted orb for his Dragapult. 9th placer Kyle Romanini chose the lower damage options of Scald, Dazzling Gleam, and Ice Beam, heavily indexing into Primarina's utility even when not Dynamax. Going up the power scale, 7th placer Eduardo Giunipero Ferraris went for Hydro Pump, Moonblast, and Blizzard. And finally, silver medalist Ji-Seok Lee kicked up one more notch with Hydro Cannon for more powerful max geysers. Even though all Primarinas were designed to fill about the same role in the team, you could have them singing whatever tune you liked. That said, the prima donna was silenced once more as Sword and Shield continued to add new Pokemon. Subsequent series introduced its old rivals, as well as new threats such as Regieleki. Certain familiar faces also became bigger problems with the introduction of Dynamax, most notably Kartana and Thundurus, and Primarina usage subsequently took a nosedive for the rest of the generation. Generation 9 brought some insane power creep. Was this to be the end of Primarina's time in UU? Yes, but not because it wasn't good enough for the tier. It was because Primarina was now a genuine OU Pokemon. Upon its release in the Indigo Disc, Primarina established itself as an excellent Assault Vest user that was able to take on monstrous threats like Walking Wake and Dragapult. Not permanently, just once or twice for offensive teams that need not be immediately overrun by them. And not only did Primarina check them, it actually provided pressure on the opponent in return with Flip Turn. Tapu Fini could never. That wasn't all either. Primarina also exerted immense pressure on defensive Pokemon in a way Assault Vest users rarely did, thanks to its incredible new tool, the recovery denying Psychic Noise, which also doubled as excellent coverage for Toxapex and Clodsire. Primarina indeed shut bulky answers down incredibly hard, denied Blissey and its ilk recovery, then Flip Turn on them or their switch-ins. This made taking advantage of them insanely easy for its highly appreciative teammates. It also made Primarina quite a threat, since defensive Pokemon didn't want to deal with it, and offensive Pokemon certainly didn't want to take its hits, and the Assault Vest even made it harder to take out on the special side, capable of withstanding hits like Goldango's far more easily. The hazard-heavy direction the metagame went in eventually threw a wrench in Primarina's survivability, but it didn't slow down. If your team wasn't in need of the Assault Vest sets, they would greatly enjoy those of the many variants of both the offensive and defensive variants. The multiverse of Calm Mind Primarina seemed endless. It wasn't just choosing Surf versus Hydro Pump, it was also shuffling between Substitute, Psychic Noise, and Encore, each unique in how they further made Primarina irritating to deal with. The item choice further complicated matters. Leftovers was the standard, and Heavy Duty Boots let it ignore all the spikes in the world, but it could even use Cuss Stat Berry. You know that tendency that Primarina had to get knocked down to low health while dueling and taking out opponents, leaving it to get picked off afterwards because of its low speed? Yeah, that table was turned a full 180 degrees with Cuss Stat, giving Prima priority to take out its would-be aggressor and allowing it to continue to deliver on his promise of destruction. As for the bulky sub-Calm Minder, it was more straightforward, usually preferring Draining Kiss and Psychic Noise as its attacks, because with the Liquid Voice ability, its Psychic Noise turned into Water Stat. Yes, that is as amazing as it sounds. However, it could also go with Torrent and Surf, whose greater power was more useful against threats that demanded more immediate responses, like Gouging Fire and King Gambit. Oh, and we should mention, as far as unpredictability goes, both offensive and defensive Calm Mind Primarina loved the option to Terra Steel, which made it even sturdier while completely flipping many of its weaknesses around. And we're still not done. It wasn't just Assault Vest and Calm Mind variants. Primarina also began running an excellent utility set that was basically the Assault Vest set, but with Heavy Duty Boots instead. It already had the typing and bulk to check threats nicely, and as it turned out, the ability to ignore hazards more effectively enabled it in such a role than the added special bulk it already packed a great deal of. Plus, since it didn't only have to run attacking moves like the Assault Vest did, this Prima variant was able to make excellent use of Encore, which was useful both for taking advantage of bulky Pokemon and for checking a Swords Dance King Gambit alike. Whatever the set, Primarina has been consistently an excellent OU staple, and it is particularly notable for the fact that it was never dropped to UU. Baxcalibur, Roaring Moon, and Garganacl have, but not Primarina. What a generation. Primarina went from making UU tremble to becoming true blue OU, marking its most successful appearance yet. Unfortunately for Primarina, it made a late entrance to Gen 9 and wasn't able to soak up the attention in the early format. When it did finally make its way off the ban list for Regulation F, it found itself thoroughly outclassed. Without Dynamax, Primarina is once again a potentially slow liability with not much utility. It faces competition on all fronts, whether from Ogerpon, Wellspring, Fluttermane, or even Dondozo and Toxagiri. What players that did see meager success with it almost invariably use a Calm Mind variant. Primarina's biggest saving grace is its incredible matchup against Urshifu Rapid Strike, who it can exploit to accumulate boosts and then tear through teams with Liquid Voice boosted Hyper Voices. Most items focus on that bulk, whether via leftovers or Rocky Helmet, to discourage physical attackers, especially the aforementioned Urshifu. Only a few scant players manage even a top 32 finish with it. Shoutouts to Preston Pereira's Throat Spray variant, Timothy Nurse's Life Orb version, the ever-innovating Jamie Boyd, and especially Michael Zhang, who used Life Duel over Calm Mind. Primarina's two best placements came from Miguel Paquette, who finished top 32 at the EUIC, and Nawapol Kumsup, who gave the Mon its lone top 16 finish, albeit in the much smaller Thailand championships. Primarina's a fickle performer, capable of delivering only the most specific circumstances. Otherwise, its voice tends to falter. And that's it. So how good was Primarina actually? Well, it brought the Opera House down with one stellar generation after another. It started off as an absolute force in UU, brandishing an offensive assault so difficult to withstand in spite of its low speed that its presence turned controversial, and many considered it to be suspect test worthy. And then in Generation 8, it excelled in UU once more, assisted by the additions of Calm Mind and Draining Kiss. It really took off in Generation 9 though, with an amazing new tool in Psychic Noise. It's utterly exploded, so much so that it launched itself to bona fide OU status, a spectacular starter success story. Primarina has only been around for 3 generations but thrived in all of them and shows no signs of slowing down, much less stopping. It actually only seems to be getting better. Thanks for watching everyone, and thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos and for voting for this Pokemon for this month's patron pick. And if you're interested in more content, be sure to check out our Patreon, link in the description below. And thank you so much to our Platinum tier patrons. Thank you so much to Raven Daytona Ring, Sorazan Croxon, Stoneface Colin, Bingleton, Ray, Daniel Isbeast, Glitcherton, Alex Sabo, Funky, Skylaria, and Jack G for their support of our videos. And as always, if you like the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Primarina? Would you give it anything even though it's already good? Whatever it is, let us know in the comments. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.